My name is Laura, and a year ago, my life seemed to take a turn straight out of a fairy tale. I met Alex at a friend's birthday party. He was charming, with a smile that could light up the room, and before I knew it, we were dating. Fast forward to now, we're engaged and planning our wedding in 3 months. I'm 24, living in my small but cozy apartment. It's not much, but it's mine. Alex still lives with his mom, Mrs. Wilson, in their family home. We've talked about buying our place after the wedding, a dream I often find myself lost in. Mrs. Wilson, well, she's a character. Always calling Alex, even when we're on dates. It's like she has a sixth sense for when we're together. I've tried to see it as a mother's love, but it can be a bit much. Then, 3 months before the wedding, Mrs. Wilson called me with an offer I never expected. "Laura, dear," she began in her usual formal tone, "I think it's time you start learning how to be a proper wife and mother for my Alex." I remember pausing, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Wilson, I'm not sure I understand." "It's simple," she continued. "You'll come over to our house every day for the next 3 months. I'll teach you everything you need to know about running a household." I was taken aback. This was not what I expected. "Every day? After work?" I asked. "Yes, dear. It's for your own good. And Alex's, of course." I hesitated, but a part of me didn't want to start off on the wrong foot with my future mother-in-law. "Okay, Mrs. Wilson, I'll give it a try." "Oh, wonderful. Alex will be so pleased. See you tomorrow evening, then." I hung up the phone, a mix of nerves and uncertainty churning in my stomach. Little did I know, this was the beginning of what would be the most challenging 3 months of my life. "Are you sure about this, Laura?" my best friend Sarah asked later that day. We were sitting in my tiny living room, a half-eaten pizza between us. "I don't know, Sarah. It seems important to Mrs. Wilson. And Alex, well, he thinks it's a good idea, too." Sarah frowned, looking concerned. "Just be careful, Laura. This sounds like a lot." I nodded, trying to shake off the worry. "I'll be fine. It's just for a few months, right?" But as I would soon find out, those few months would change everything. The next few weeks blurred into a routine I never imagined I'd be in. Every day, after a long day at work, I'd drag myself to Mrs. Wilson's house. The moment I stepped through the door, it was like entering a different world. "Laura, you're here! Good!" Mrs. Wilson would greet me, barely looking up from her knitting. "Let's start with dinner. I expect you to cook something nice for us." The kitchen became my battleground. I was never a bad cook, but under Mrs. Wilson's critical eye, I felt like a complete novice. "This is how you chop onions? My goodness, girl, you're slow. And watch your fingers," she'd chide, making me even more nervous. One evening, as I struggled to get the seasoning right for a stew, Alex walked in. I hoped for some support, or at least a kind word. "Smells good, Laura," he said casually, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm just trying to get it right. Mrs. Wilson has been teaching me a lot." He laughed, a sound that once brought me joy, but now felt distant. "Mom knows best. You're lucky to have her guidance." I wanted to say something, to tell him how exhausted I was, but the words wouldn't come out. I just nodded and went back to stirring the stew. Every task was a test. Washing dishes, ironing Alex's shirts, even vacuuming the house. Mrs. Wilson had a specific way for everything, and nothing I did seemed to meet her standards. "You need to iron the creases sharper, Laura. Alex likes them that way," she instructed one evening as I struggled with the ironing board. I tried to hide my frustration. "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Wilson." And so it went. Days turned into weeks. I kept telling myself it was a phase, something to endure for Alex's sake, for our future. But as I lay in bed each night, my body aching and my mind racing, I couldn't help but wonder if this was really what my life was going to be. A never-ending cycle of trying to please someone who seemed impossible to satisfy. My friends started noticing the change in me. "You look tired, Laura," Sarah commented one day. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just busy with the wedding prep and all. You know how it is." But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the wedding stress. It was this new life I had stepped into, one where I was constantly trying to prove myself to a woman who seemed determined to find fault in everything I did. And the worst part? I was beginning to lose sight of who I was in the process. The weekdays were tough, but the weekends brought a whole new level of challenge. Mrs. Wilson hosted her relatives almost every Saturday, and I was expected to cook and cater for all of them. It was a Saturday morning, and I was already in the kitchen, a long list of dishes to prepare. Mrs. Wilson entered, her arms crossed. "Remember, Laura, my family has high standards. You need to impress them," she said, eyeing the ingredients I had laid out. I nodded, feeling the pressure. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Wilson." As the day progressed, the kitchen felt more like a pressure cooker. I was chopping, stirring, and baking, trying to keep up with the endless list of tasks. The clock seemed to tick louder with each passing minute. The guests began to arrive, and the house filled with chatter and laughter. I was in the kitchen, putting the final touches on the dishes, when Alex popped his head in. "Need any help, Laura?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. I wanted to say yes, to tell him I was overwhelmed, but I didn't. "No, I've got it. Thanks, though." He shrugged and left, joining the laughter in the other room. I felt a pang of loneliness, realizing how isolated I had become in this house. Dinner was served, and I stood back as everyone started eating. I watched nervously, hoping they'd like the food. Mrs. Wilson's sister, Aunt Linda, was the first to comment. "This is quite different. Not what we're used to, right, Margaret?" Mrs. Wilson gave me a disapproving look. "Laura is still learning. She's doing her best." The critiques didn't stop. Each dish seemed to bring another round of subtle digs and comments. I felt smaller with each word. After dinner, while everyone was relaxing in the living room, Mrs. Wilson cornered me in the kitchen. "Laura, this was not up to our family's standards. You need to work harder. You made me look bad in front of everyone," she hissed. I felt tears well up in my eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson. I really tried." "Trying isn't enough. You need to do better. Much better." I nodded, trying to hold back my tears as I started clearing the dishes. Later, Alex found me in the kitchen, alone, washing dishes. "Hey, don't take it to heart. Mom can be tough," he said, in a tone that was supposed to be comforting. I looked at him, my frustration finally finding words. "Alex, it's not just tough. It's too much. I'm trying so hard, and it's never enough." He seemed taken aback. "It's just how she is. She wants everything to be perfect. Don't worry, you'll get used to it." Get used to it. Those words echoed in my head as I went to bed that night. Was this what my life was going to be? Constantly trying to meet impossible standards and losing myself in the process? The thought scared me more than anything. Just when I thought things couldn't get tougher, they did. Alex's sister Julia started dropping her kids off at Mrs. Wilson's house every weekend. Julia had 2 kids, a 4-year-old boy, Max, and a baby girl, Lily. Looking after them became my responsibility. One Saturday morning, Julia breezed in with the kids in tow, her casual demeanor in stark contrast to my growing anxiety. "Hey, Laura! Great, you're here! The kids will be your little project for today," Julia said, barely giving me a chance to respond. All day?" I asked, trying to mask my surprise. "Yeah, I have a ton of errands. You don't mind, right?" Julia didn't wait for my reply, swiftly heading out the door. There I was, with 2 kids, in addition to the usual weekend chores. Max was energetic and needed constant attention, while Lily needed her diaper changed and bottle-fed. Juggling between them and the kitchen was exhausting. Mrs. Wilson was of no help. "You need to learn, Laura. This is what family life is about," she said, observing me struggle with Lily and a fussy Max. By the time Julia returned in the afternoon, the house was a mess, the kids were cranky, and I was on the brink of tears. "What happened here?" Julia exclaimed, looking around the disarrayed living room. "I tried my best, Julia. Max and Lily needed a lot of attention," I explained, feeling defeated. "Well, you'll just have to get better at managing, won't you? After all, you'll have your own someday," Julia said nonchalantly, rounding up her kids. That night, after everyone had left and I was alone cleaning up, Mrs. Wilson came into the kitchen. "You need to pull yourself together, Laura. Today was not acceptable," she said, her tone cold and firm. "I'm doing everything I can, Mrs. Wilson," I replied, the day's frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not enough. You need to be more efficient, more organized. That's what being a part of this family means, she retorted before leaving the kitchen. As I sat there, surrounded by toys and dirty dishes, I felt a sense of hopelessness. This wasn't the family life I had dreamed of. It was a never-ending cycle of demands and criticisms. And with each passing day, my spirit, my very essence, seemed to be eroding away. I wondered if Alex understood or cared about how much I was struggling. But deep down, I knew the answer, and it scared me more than anything. Exhaustion became my constant companion. It followed me to work, where I found myself struggling to focus. One afternoon, it caught up with me. I was at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen, when my eyes involuntarily closed. I jerked awake to the sound of my name. "Laura, are you okay?" It was my boss, Mrs. Thompson, standing by my desk with a concerned look. I sat up quickly, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson. I didn't sleep well." She pulled up a chair and sat down. "This isn't just about last night, is it? You've been looking run down for weeks. What's going on?" I hesitated, but the words just came pouring out. I told her about the wedding preparations, Mrs. Wilson's training, the weekends with Alex's niece and nephew, everything. Mrs. Thompson listened quietly, her expression turning from concern to disbelief. "Laura, this isn't training or preparation. It sounds like you're being used. You're not a maid or a nanny. You're supposed to be their family," she said, her voice firm. Her words hit me hard. But I thought I was doing it for Alex, for our future. "Laura, a relationship is a partnership. It's about support and respect, not servitude. You need to think about whether this is the life you want." Her words echoed in my head as I left her office. For the first time, I allowed myself to really think about everything that had been happening. Was this really what I wanted? Was I happy? That evening, as I made my way to Mrs. Wilson's house, I felt a growing sense of dread. The familiar tasks awaited me, but now they felt even more burdensome. During dinner, Mrs. Wilson was her usual critical self. "Laura, this chicken is overcooked. You really must pay more attention." I looked up from my plate, something inside me snapping. "I'm trying my best, Mrs. Wilson. I work all day and then come here and try to do everything you ask." She looked at me, surprised by my outburst. "Well, your best isn't good enough. You need to try harder." I wanted to say more, to tell her how unfair she was being, but I couldn't find the words. I just nodded and went back to my dinner, a storm of emotions brewing inside me. Later that night, I lay in bed, Mrs. Thompson's words replaying in my mind. I realized that I had been so focused on trying to please Mrs. Wilson and Alex that I had lost sight of my own happiness. For the first time, I questioned whether this wedding, this future with Alex, was what I truly wanted. It was a scary thought, but it was the wake-up call I desperately needed. The next day, a heavy feeling sat in my chest as I went about my work. Mrs. Thompson's words had opened a door I couldn't close anymore. I knew I had to face the reality of my situation. That evening, I took an early leave from work, and instead of heading straight to Mrs. Wilson's house, I decided to take a detour. I needed some time to think, to clear my head. But as I drove around, a nagging thought kept pulling me back. I arrived at Mrs. Wilson's house earlier than usual. I didn't call ahead, which was out of the ordinary for me. The house was unusually quiet as I let myself in with the key Alex had given me. I was about to call out when I heard voices from the living room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed closer. It was Mrs. Wilson, Alex, and his sister Julia, their voices a mix of laughter and hushed tones. "And she just keeps coming back for more," I heard Julia say, her voice tinged with amusement. "I know, it's hilarious. Laura thinks she's proving herself, but really, she's just a free housekeeper. And after the wedding, she'll be completely under our control," Mrs. Wilson chimed in, a note of triumph in her voice. I felt my heart pound in my chest. This couldn't be happening. "And the best part is, she buys all the groceries with her own money. We haven't spent a dime," Alex added, laughing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My Alex, the man I loved, was in on this too. I stepped into the living room, unable to contain my shock and anger. "How could you?" I blurted out. The three of them turned to me, their expressions shifting from amusement to shock. "Laura, how long have you been standing there?" Mrs. Wilson stammered. "Long enough," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't believe I fell for all of this. I thought we were a family." Alex stood up, his face a mix of guilt and confusion. "Laura, it's not what you think. We were just joking around." "A joke?" I laughed bitterly. "I've been slaving away for months, thinking I was building a life with you, and you were all laughing at me." Mrs. Wilson tried to interject. "Laura, dear, you're overreacting. We only wanted the best for you." "The best for me? By treating me like a servant? By making fun of me behind my back?" I couldn't hold back the tears. Julia was quiet, avoiding my gaze, while Alex seemed at a loss for words. "I thought I was joining a family. I thought I was loved, but I was just a convenience to you all," I said, the reality of the situation sinking in. "Laura, please, let's talk about this." Alex started, but I held up my hand. "No, Alex, there's nothing left to talk about. I can't be a part of this farce." I turned and walked out the door, leaving behind the house, the people, and the life I once thought I wanted. In that moment, I felt a mix of pain and relief. It was over. The truth was out, and I was finally free from the illusion I had been living in. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the conversation over and over. By morning, my decision was clear. I couldn't marry Alex. I couldn't be part of a family that saw me as nothing more than a tool to be used. I went to Mrs. Wilson's house one last time, needing to end things officially. My heart pounded as I rang the doorbell. Alex opened the door, his eyes red, like he hadn't slept much either. "Laura, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk," he said, his voice hopeful. I stepped inside, my resolve firm. "We can talk, but my decision won't change." Mrs. Wilson was in the living room, her usual stern look replaced with a softer, almost pleading expression. "Laura, please understand, we didn't mean any harm. It's just our way of testing your commitment," she said, trying to justify their actions. "Testing my commitment?" I repeated, disbelief coloring my tone. "By treating me like a servant and laughing at me?" Alex stepped forward. "Laura, I love you. I didn't want to hurt you. It's just, my mom's way can be a bit extreme." "Love isn't about testing and humiliating each other, Alex," I said, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. "I wanted a partner, a family. But what you all did, it's unforgivable." Mrs. Wilson sighed. "Laura, think about the wedding, the plans, the money we've spent." "I am thinking, Mrs. Wilson, about my dignity, my self-respect. The wedding is off. I can't marry into this family." Alex's face fell, his earlier hopefulness vanishing. "But Laura, we can fix this. Please, don't make a decision in anger." "It's not anger, Alex, it's realization. Realization that I deserve better," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Mrs. Wilson stood up, her demeanor changing. "You're making a big mistake, Laura. You won't find someone else who will treat you as well as we would have." I almost laughed at the absurdity of her words. I'd rather be alone than with people who don't respect me. Turning away from them, I walked to the door. Alex followed, his pleas fading with each step I took. "Laura, please." I stopped, turning to face him one last time. "Goodbye, Alex. I hope one day you understand why I had to do this." Walking away from Alex and his family felt like shedding a heavy burden, but it didn't end there. My phone became a constant reminder of the ties I was trying to cut. Alex and Mrs. Wilson kept calling, each time with a new plea or demand. One evening, as I was unwinding from work, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Wilson. I took a deep breath and answered. "Laura, you have to pay us back. We spent a fortune on the wedding arrangements," she demanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and disbelief. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm not responsible for the expenses you chose to make. Consider that money as a lesson learned, or maybe a rehearsal for Alex's next wedding." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a huff. "You're being unreasonable, Laura." "I think I've been more than reasonable all this time," I replied, my voice steady. "Goodbye, Mrs. Wilson." And I hung up, feeling a sense of empowerment. The calls from Alex were harder. He was apologetic, his voice laced with regret. "Laura, please, I was wrong. I let Mom and Julia influence me too much. We can still make this work," he pleaded during one of the calls. "Alex, it's too late. I can't be with someone who didn't respect me enough to stand up for me," I said, the finality in my voice clear. "But I love you, Laura, I really do," he insisted, his voice cracking. "I deserve to be loved better, Alex. Take care of yourself." And with that, I ended the call, knowing it was the last time we would speak. The following days were a mix of emotions. There was relief, but also a sense of loss for what could have been. But as I reconnected with friends and dove back into my hobbies and work, I felt a renewed sense of self. One evening, while painting in my living room, I realized something profound. I was stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. I had stood up against manipulation and disrespect, and in doing so, I had found my own voice. I didn't know what the future held, but I was optimistic. For the first time in a long time, I was excited about the possibilities ahead. This was my new beginning, and I was ready to embrace whatever came my way.
All right, everyone's presentations are done, Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my second year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, "I'm thirsty." Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. "I don't care what they say, I plan to quit any time," he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look, "To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day." Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. "So, you all get a chance." As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. "Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them." It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. "All right, everyone's presentations are done." "Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something." Nick interrupted me. "There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer." He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. "Still here?" Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. "I'm leaving." I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! What's wrong? Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I immediately followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was, as the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their in. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, "I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong." "Mike! What have you done?" Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're still saying that?" "Look at him." Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. "I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract?" Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. "Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go." Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. "Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him." There's no way he was pushed aside. "Don't make things worse here." "He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he?" I don't remember that part." I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.